Okay. Moral responsibility in the age of bureaucracy. Let's actually start here. So, this is What is Ethics Anyway? And may remember that for utilitarianism, the central principle is this one. The morally correct action is the one that produces the greatest amount of happiness for all involved. And then for Kantian ethics, the central principle is the categorical imperative. Act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. That is, act only in accordance with those rules which, at the same time that you're following those rules, you can reasonably wish for them to become universal laws. That is, laws that everyone else in that same situation would have to follow. Okay, so what the authors in this article are saying is, if we skip ahead here, on page 49, they point out that virtually every approach to normative ethics, that is, ethics, focuses primary attention on moral problems in which 4 knowledge conditions are satisfied. So those 2 principles that we just looked at assume that these 4 conditions are satisfied. First, the decision maker knows that a decision must be made. Second, the decision maker knows when a decision must be made, or at least by when it must be made. Third, the decision maker confronts a small number of well-defined options. So that's actually something we talked about a lot in the What is Ethics Anyway article. If you have 2 options, we can use those principles to determine which is the morally acceptable one. So that's assuming that you know what those options are. And then fourth, the decision maker has the information needed to make the decision. Okay, so we assume that those 4 conditions are in place when we use utilitarianism or Kantian ethics to determine what the morally correct action is. But the authors are pointing out that often in bureaucratic situations, bureaucratic settings, for instance, a company or even somewhere like a school, a university, but in particular, we care about companies. In those situations, those 4 conditions may not be satisfied for an individual. The individual may not know specifically that a decision has to be made when or by when, what the available options are, or may not have the relevant information. Hence, they can't even really begin to employ utilitarianism or Kantian ethics or whatever it might be. So instead, the authors of this article propose replacing those moral principles that you already know about, that you have some familiarity with these 5 obligations. An obligation of investigation. So these are the obligations that individuals in, say, a large corporation would have. Obligations of investigation, obligations of communication, obligations of protection, obligations of prevention, and obligations of precaution. Okay, now, so that's basically what the authors are doing. Let's look over the sections before we get into the article itself. So they begin with the background of the problem, and this is some real background here on the second page of the article, page 47. They have the historical perspective here on 48, psychology of destructive obedience. Here they talk about the Milgram experiments, which you may be familiar with. Then on 49, the inadequacy of ethical tradition and philosophical theory. That's where they discuss those conditions that we assume are in place when we use utilitarianism or Kantian ethics. Then here in responsibility without knowledge is where they're going to lay out their own program for how individuals can have moral responsibilities even when those 4 conditions that they discussed over here haven't been satisfied. So extending individual responsibility, and then here in the second column on page 51, they get into the obligations, the 5 of them. Then in the second column on 52, they get into some details about them or some details about how they can be applied. Same here on 53, and then the conclusion. Okay, background of the problem. The bureaucratic fragmentation of knowledge and dilution of responsibility are pervasive phenomena in modern society. To set the stage for our analysis, we first describe the scope of the problem and briefly review some of the research, commentary, and debate it has provoked. We conclude this background section by discussing the research most relevant to our own concerns, the Milgram studies of destructive obedience to authority. Actually, before we get into the article, let's look at this little abstract that they begin with. So, large bureaucratic organizations frequently dilute an individual's sense of moral responsibility, and members of such organizations are all too likely to acquiesce in organizational misconduct. One reason for this is that inside the organization, knowledge can be so fragmented that an individual may be partially or wholly ignorant of what the organization is doing. So the authors, Luban, Strudler, and Wasserman, examine this problem. Whereas most moral theories presuppose that the moral agent, that is the person who has to make the decision, knows that a decision must be made and what choices are available, these authors explore the moral responsibilities of individuals in organizational situations in which they lack this knowledge. Okay, the collectivization of the workplace. Most work in modern society is done by organizations, corporations, governments, hospitals, foundations, universities, accounting firms, armies, even such supposedly independent professionals as physicians and lawyers practice in large organizations to an ever-increasing extent. The HMO has replaced the family physician, and the new graduates of today's law schools join firms, of which the largest now employ over 1,000 lawyers, rather than hanging out a shingle. That is, rather than going into business for themselves. The problems of professional and business ethics have thus become the problems of supervisors and subordinates in organizational settings. Indeed, in a culture such as ours, where our first question to each other is often not, how do you do, but what do you do, the ethics of the workplace has enormous impact on how we think of morality in general. To a great extent, ethics in the organizational setting has come to define ethics as a whole. We speak of team players and loose cannons, leaders and followers as categories of moral judgment and not simply of social description. The organizational man and other directed society. The transformation of the workplace appears to have wrought a transformation in values, replacing individual responsibility and internal norms with group identification and external norms. As the post-war American economy assumed its contemporary form, several leading social scientists and commentators explored the psychology of the organization man in the famous title of William H. White's book. White used this term to describe the ones in our middle class who have left home spiritually as well as physically to take the vows of organization life. He ascribed to them the social ethic, which includes a belief in the group as the source of creativity, as well as a belief in belongingness as the ultimate need of the individual. David Reisman described middle-class Americans as a lonely crowd and elaborated a famous typology of characters. In Reisman's scheme, people of pre-modern societies were tradition-directed, and the sanction for deviation was shame. In early modern societies, people were inner-directed, guided by an internal moral compass acquired in childhood, which resulted in guilt when one deviates. In contemporary society, however, we have become other-directed. Our contemporaries are the source of direction for the individual. The process of paying close attention to the signals from others remains unaltered throughout life. For the other-directed individuals, the sanction for deviance has changed. As against guilt and shame controls, though of course these survive, one prime psychological lever of the other-directed person is a diffuse anxiety. Okay, so in these three categories, you may not know, but what do we have here? Early modern societies, so there we're talking about 1600s and 1700s. So pre-modern is even earlier than that. So pre-modern societies were tradition-directed. Early modern societies, starting in, say, 1600, were inner-directed. And then contemporary refers, in this kind of context, to, say, from 1950 on. So these three are pretty general categories, covering centuries, really. And I'm not sure that this idea of how we sanction people is really accurate, but it does give us this picture that, over time, our moral orientation has changed. Sociologist Robert Jackal conducted interviews with 143 managers in several contemporary American corporations. In the anxiety-ridden world of middle management, managers have a myriad of aphorisms that refer to how the power of CEOs, magnified through zealous efforts of subordinates, affects them. One such maxim is, when he sneezes, that is the CEO, we all catch colds. Jackal comments, as a result, independent morally evaluative judgments get subordinated to the social intricacies of the bureaucratic workplace. Notions of morality that one might hold and indeed practice outside the workplace become irrelevant. Under certain conditions, such notions may even become dangerous. For the most part, then, they remain unarticulated, lest one risk damaging crucial relationships with significant individuals or groups. Okay, so that might even resonate with you if you right now work for a large corporation. Okay, page 47, we have the historical perspective. The collectivization of the workplace and the threat it poses to traditional moral values are hardly new phenomena. They have been recognized and lamented for the past 150 years. The erosion of individual responsibility and the evils of bureaucracy have engaged conservative writers since the advent of the Industrial Revolution. Over a century ago, Karl Marx likewise criticized what he called the real mindlessness of the state, the bureaucracy of a circle from which no one can escape, Marx contended. The highest point entrusts the understanding of particulars to the lower echelons, whereas these, on the other hand, credit the highest with an understanding in regard to the universal. That is the big picture. And thus, they deceive one another. In 1932, Reinhold Niebuhr wrote his classic treatise, Moral Man and Immoral Society, in which he argued that individual men may be moral. They are endowed by nature with a measure of sympathy and consideration for their kind, the breadth of which may be extended by an astute social pedagogy. But all these achievements are more difficult, if not impossible, for human societies and social groups. In every human group, there is less reason to guide and to check impulse, less capacity for self-transcendence, less ability to comprehend the needs of others, and therefore more unrestrained egoism than the individuals who compose the group reveal in their personal relationships. Okay, so I sketched this out for you. So what Niebuhr is saying is, first, that individuals are naturally moral. I don't know if that's true. There might be some debate about that. Then in groups, they have less reason to guide and check impulse, less capacity for self-transcendence, less ability to comprehend the needs of others. Therefore, in groups, people display more unrestrained egoism. Okay, so egoism can mean different things in different contexts. I'm not quite sure what this sociologist in the 1930s exactly would have meant by it, but basically it's going to be something along the lines of, very consuming self-interest, very consuming focus on oneself. Oh, and also self-transcendence, that would be the ability to go beyond one's normal limits. Okay, so this is the picture we have from Niebuhr. Niebuhr's argument recognizes the increasing organization of society will be accompanied by a delusion of morality. The problems Marx and Niebuhr discussed in a theoretical vein came to life in the most horrible possible way during World War II, where ostensibly civilized human beings tortured and slaughtered 12 million men, women, and children in extermination camps. The names of these camps, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Majdanek, have become synonymous with the incomprehensible willingness of ordinary human beings to do anything, no matter how atrocious, when ordered to do so by those in authority. Here again, an explanation may be offered in terms of the division of responsibility within groups. Consider a historian's description of the euthanasia program Hitler ordered to eliminate mentally retarded, handicapped, or genetically ill Germans, individuals Hitler called useless eaters. The euthanasia program demonstrated how, through fragmentation of authority and tasks, it was possible to fashion a murder machine. Hitler had enunciated an offhand extra-legal decree and had not wanted to be bothered about it again. Brandt had ordered the scientific implementation of the program and, like Hitler, wished to hear no complaints. The directors and personnel of institutions rationalized that matters were out of their hands and that they were just filling out questionnaires, although in reality each form was the equivalent of a death warrant. The personnel at the end of the line excused themselves on the basis that they were under compulsion, had no power of decision, and were merely performing a function. Thousands of people were involved, but each considered himself nothing but a cog in the machine and reasoned that it was the machine, not he, that was responsible. Okay, so back here again, just from that quote, we have, this isn't an argument at all, this is just kind of the layers or the levels of what was going on. So first, Hitler ordered the program, then Brandt specified how the program should go. The directors and personnel of the institutions housing the disabled rationalized that matters were out of their hands and they were just filling out questionnaires. And then finally, the personnel carrying out the killings excused themselves on the basis that they were under compulsion, had no power of decision, and were merely performing a function. Okay, so one of the reasons actually I sketched those two quotes out for you is because, so on page 47, we have 4 historical perspectives. Marx, Niebuhr, this Nazi example, and then there's this 4th one we'll get to in a second. And generally speaking, the authors are trying to make this point that in groups or in bureaucratic environments, things can become unraveled, morally speaking. One thing to think about, though, and so sometimes in the classroom we'll talk about this, is if each of these 4 are really making exactly the same point. I mean, they all are describing things going wrong in a group or in a bureaucratic setting, but it's not totally clear that, for instance, Niebuhr and this Hitler example exactly match. Maybe they do in part, and then the same with the Marx and this last one here. So that's one thing to think about. But okay, the horrors of Nazism are without parallel, but the bureaucratic pattern of organization that fragments the knowledge required for moral decision-making is common to large institutions throughout contemporary society. Jackal describes the typical corporate structure in terms not unlike those Marx used to characterize the real mindlessness of the state. Power is concentrated at the top in the person of the chief executive officer and is simultaneously decentralized, that is, responsibility for decisions and profits is pushed as far down the organizational line as possible. Pushing details down protects the privilege of authority to declare that a mistake has been made. Moreover, pushing down details relieves superiors of the burden of too much knowledge, particularly guilty knowledge. Middle managers become the point men of a given strategy and the potential fall guys when things go wrong. Hannah Arendt described the bureaucratic phenomenon as a novel form of governance, appearing alongside the classic distinction among rule by one, that is monarchy, rule by the best, aristocracy, rule by the few, oligarchy, and rule by the many, democracy. She wrote of the latest and perhaps most formidable form of domination, bureaucracy, or the rule of an intricate system of bureaus in which no men, neither one nor the best, neither the few nor the many, can be held responsible, and which could be properly called rule by nobody. If, in accord with traditional political thought, we identify tyranny as government that is not held to give account of itself, rule by nobody is clearly the most tyrannical of all, since there is no one left who could even be asked to answer for what is being done. It is impossible to localize responsibility and to identify the enemy. Okay, so sometime when I was reading this, I just made a note here. Would Boeing, the airplane manufacturer, be an example of what Arendt is talking about here? So you may know or you may recall that after 2 of Boeing's planes crashed, there was a lot of interest in what was going on in the company, and the CEO had to testify before the Senate, and he didn't really make a very compelling case that anyone was taking responsibility for what was going on at the company. So, this may be a little bit exaggerated, but there may be situations where we can see this in corporations. Such rumors of the demise of responsibility may be exaggerated, yet Arendt's description has the ring of familiarity. Okay, so another example. A graphic contemporary analog appeared in litigation surrounding the Dalkin Shield. In his opinion, federal judge Frank Thies angrily noted, so Dalkin Shield was a birth control device that was manufactured, I think it was, the early 1970s. So it was an IUD that caused infections, didn't really prevent pregnancies that well, killed at least a few people, and so just in general was a failure. The project manager for Dalton Shield explains that a particular question should have gone to the medical department. The medical department representative explains that the question is really the bailiwick of the quality control department, and the quality control department representative explains that the project manager was the one with the authority to make a decision on that question. It is not at all unusual for the hard questions posed in Dalton Shield cases to be unanswerable by anyone from Robbins, the manufacturer. Okay, the authors continue. One must not be naive, of course. Often the defense of fragmented knowledge will be entered falsely and cynically as a form of liability screening. Executives in the hot seat should be treated with the same skepticism that greeted German officials, that is, Nazi officials, who didn't know. Despite this healthy skepticism, however, we remain convinced that fragmented knowledge is a genuine phenomenon that we cannot simply dismiss as a lame excuse. Okay, the psychology of destructive obedience. Social scientists have labored to understand the Holocaust and to answer the all-important question whether it could occur in other settings. Stanley Milgram conducted perhaps the most significant and certainly the most famous experimental studies to address this issue. Okay, so in particular, Milgram's experiments, and you may be familiar with these experiments from a psychology class, but in particular, they were at the time aimed at determining if situations like this one here, the personnel at the end of the line excused themselves on the basis that they were under compulsion, had no power of decision, and were merely performing a function. So Milgram wanted to know, were those things that occurred in Nazi Germany for some reason particular to that time and place, or could really anyone who was in that kind of situation do those kinds of things? So Milgram's experiments underscore our thesis because they illustrate the ways in which social and institutional pressures to obey reinforce and are reinforced by the fragmentation of knowledge in modern bureaucracies and other large organizations. In Milgram's experiments, volunteers in a Yale University experiment were ordered by the experimenter to administer gradually increasing electric shocks to another quote-unquote subject, actually a confederate of the experimenter. Okay, so the idea was if you were participating in this study, you would show up and you would be administering the shocks. There would be another person who was receiving the shocks who you would think was also just another participant in the study. But in fact, the person who was allegedly receiving the shocks wasn't actually receiving shocks and was working with the experimenter. So in fact, no one was being shocked in this, but that wasn't known to the actual participants in the study. Okay, so ordered by the experimenter to administer gradually increasing electric shocks to another subject, ostensibly to study the effects of punishment on learning. As the shocks increased in intensity, the confederate displayed increasing discomfort, demanded that the experiment stop, screamed with pain, complained of a heart condition, and finally fell silent as if he were unconscious. In this original experiment, 65% of the subjects went all the way, administering the highest possible potentially lethal level of shock. Those subjects who administered the maximum shock expressed great discomfort at the cruel task they were assigned. Many of them berated the experimenter, protested or insisted that they would not proceed with the experiment, all the while continuing to flip the switches. Milgram conducted a number of important variations on the original experiment, several of which suggest the role that incomplete and fragmented knowledge may play in facilitating destructive obedience and the abdication of individual responsibility. In one version, the experiment was removed from the anxiety-relieving auspices of Yale to a seedy-looking storefront operation in nearby Bridgeport. Less able to reassure themselves that the experimenters knew what they were doing, 53% of the subjects refused to go all the way. This suggests that compliant subordinates often believe that their qualms are merely the result of incomplete understanding and assume that those in charge have good reason for what they are doing. Okay, so the idea would be you're a participant, you show up either, if you show up at Yale, that's a very prestigious university, has a beautiful campus, you can reasonably assume that the scientists working there know what they're doing and are doing important things. So in that situation, you might assume that those in charge have good reason for doing what they're doing. Conversely, so Bridgeport is a city not far from Yale, but it's kind of a little bit of a rough city. So you show up there as seedy-looking storefront operation, you're going to be much less likely to assume that the people running the experiment in that scenario, know what they're doing or have good reason for what they're doing or, are as qualified or whatever it might be. The rate of compliance also declined when the subject could see the victim and declined even further when the subject was actually required to hold the victim's hand on the contact plate. In this latter version of the experiment, 70% of the subjects stopped before administering the maximum level of shock. Another form of ignorance that appears to have played a significant role in Milgram's experiments was the absence of a clear-cut moment of decision. Few subjects would have hesitated to give a mild, tingling shock. Most probably would have refused to give an initial shock of maximum voltage. The gradual escalation of voltage was insidious because it deprived subjects of an obvious stopping point, encouraging them to defer resistance until they saw themselves as committed or as compromised. This kind of slippery slope may characterize many of the decisions made in contemporary organizations. Another variant of the Milgram experiments, however, provides some encouragement that resistance and reform may be possible in organizational settings. In this study, the subject was assigned to a team administering the shocks while the other team members were really confederates of the experimenter. Milgram discovered that compliance was extraordinarily sensitive to peer pressure. When the other team members refused to proceed with the experiment, only 10% of the subjects remained obedient to the experimenter and went all the way. Conversely, when a teammate rather than the subject took charge of physically administering the shock, 92.5% of the subjects went along with the experiment up to the maximum shock. Okay, so if you're in a team, so you show up, you're a participant in the study, you think these other people are also participants, but they're working with the experimenter, but you're in a team with them. If the other people don't proceed with the experiment, then you're less likely to. If the other people do take charge and are willing to proceed with the experiment, then you're much more likely to go along. So, the authors say this provides some encouragement that resistance and reform may be possible in organizational settings. Maybe could go either way. Could be encouraging or could be discouraging, depending on how you look at it. The Milgram studies then suggest the role of imperfect and fragmented knowledge in organizational misconduct. The less individuals appreciate the consequences of their acts, the need to decide, and the available alternatives, the easier it will be for them to engage in destructive obedience. Milgram's experiments suggest that the fragmentation of knowledge promotes organizational wrongdoing by blunting the edge of moral conflict. Although Milgram's research focused on subordinates, parallel problems arise for supervisors. As we have seen, bureaucratic structures serve to deny supervisors knowledge of the operational details, blunt their awareness of harsh consequences, and help them rationalize what they cannot ignore. The result is the deep paradox of the rule by nobody. When neither superiors nor subordinates may be held responsible, we face an uncanny situation in which responsibility has seemingly been conjured out of existence.